My name is Emily Stone, and I am the Naturalist and Education Director at the Cable Natural History Museum. And we have a pretty interesting presentation for you tonight, very timely and of the moment. So there, as many of you know, there was a wolf hunt recently, and that has sparked a lot of questions and controversy. And Adrian Wydeven has offered to be here to give us a summary of what happened and then also open up to answering your questions. And Adrian Wydeven is a longtime member and volunteer at the museum for many years. He was kind of known as the wolf guy in Wisconsin. He worked for the DNR and then also the Timberwolf Alliance, and really has kept up with wolf issues in the area. He's also one of the most well-reasoned and well thought out voice on wolves that I know of. So he really, I think, has a balanced view on wolf management that we can all learn from. Without further ado, Adrian, you are welcome to take yourself off mute and go ahead and give us your summary.
Thank you all for attending. I've been getting a bunch of questions from a lot of people and had sort of a discussion going online, and I thought maybe it'd be a good idea to do this in a larger setting. Ideally, what I would have liked is sat around a table at the Rivers Eatery and had some of mixed fine brews, but we probably wouldn't be able to fit this whole group in there anyway, so this probably will work just as well. So what I wanted to do is give a little bit of background about wolf hunting in Wisconsin, what's happened before, the history of wolves, and then what happened with this last wolf hunt, and then open it up to discussions and questions and try to answer as many of those as we can, and maybe kind of where do we go from here? What's the next step for Wisconsin wolf conservation? So anyway, most of you know wolves disappeared from Wisconsin in the 1950s, early 60s, and were extirpated from the state for about 15 years, started returning to Wisconsin in the mid-1970s in extreme northwestern Wisconsin. This map kind of shows how they spread across Wisconsin, the light blue indicating where they first entered the state, and then as it gets darker, how they spread across the state. So this kind of shows our current distribution, with wolves existing across all of northern Wisconsin and into the central forest regions and along the Wisconsin Riverway. And gray wolves have been a conservation success story in the state. So wolf management planning in Wisconsin has been based on a couple of different documents. There was a recovery plan that was used in the state of Wisconsin in the 1980s that set a goal for getting the population from a state endangered status to a state threatened status, and then a state wolf management plan that was developed in 1999. There were some modifications to that plan in 2007, but for most part, we're still operating on that 99 plan, which was an okay plan at the time, but now it's way overdue and it's 21 years old. So we've seen some growth in the Wisconsin wolf population. Excuse me. This graph shows the minimum count of the state wolf population against the different management levels designated by the state of Wisconsin. And it shows two lines because state management is based on numbers of wolves outside of Indian reservations, which is just slightly less than the statewide count. So the darker blue line is a count outside of Indian reservations. Any one year, we've got anywhere from 15, maybe as many as 40 wolves that live on Indian reservations. And the state of Wisconsin doesn't have any management authority on reservation land. So the goals have always been based on numbers of wolves outside of reservations. And the 99 plan set a management goal of 350 wolves, but you can see that we've gone far above that management goal. So the wolves are doing quite well in Wisconsin. This graphic shows the growth of the wolf population against the various federal listings, and the pink in the background is wolves listed as an endangered species by the federal government. The yellow is when they were downlisted to threatened species, and the green was when they were delisted and full state management was authorized. So that last happened in 2014, and then for the last 6 years they were on endangered species list, and just this last January, wolves were again delisted. So this has been kind of an ongoing off again, on again effort within Wisconsin, that we're part of the time we're federally listed, part of the time we're listed as a state managed species. And unfortunately, I think the back and forth has created a lot of animosity and some backlash toward the wolf population. No, I just want to go with the arrows here because that's the only thing. Ooh, no, I can't get the arrow to work. Right here. Okay, so with the growth of the wolf population too, we've seen a lot of ecological benefits from wolves. We're seeing in the interior of wolf pack areas, there's a greater diversity of understory plants. There's less browsing on trees, young saplings and shrubs. And at the edge of wolf pack areas, you've got more grasses and ferns, the plants that are less palatable to deer. So we're seeing kind of ecological effects. One of the effects of wolves may be that the reduced presence of chronic wasting disease in northern Wisconsin. There's evidence that wolves may be a factor in preventing it from spreading into our area. So we're starting to see a lot of the ecological effects of having a healthy wolf population. But there's a downside too with the wolves, and that's depredation on livestock and some on pets. And that, let's see, looks like some of our pictures are right on the graph. Is there a way we can move those, or are people not seeing that? Or am I just seeing that?
That's just you if you're seeing.
Okay, so I know what's on the graph. I just have videos in front of me.
Drag that around and move people's pictures off.
That's okay. I know what's over there, as long as I know it's, as long as folks can see it. So
it is blocking it.
We can't get blocking. We can't see past 2010.
Okay, so it is blocking it for some people. So
minimize it to the left, minimize there.
Okay.
And then.
Does that work for folks? So the numbers of farms kind of peaked in 2010 and has declined since then. And we see it especially coming down extensively during the periods when wolves were delisted in 2012, 13, and 14. And that was probably mostly because there were federal trappers able to remove problem wolves, and also perhaps some effect from the hunting seasons that were held at the time. But it starts going up a little bit after that when the state lost management authority and they went back on endangered species list, although it didn't go as high as 2010 and 11. And I think in part because the federal agency working with depredation management was doing a very aggressive job at non-lethal controls. But with non-lethal controls, there are limitations as to how much they can do. And there's need to have some authority for lethal controls to bring the numbers of farms further down. The other thing we know too is that wolves occasionally kill dogs, and it's most common amongst dogs that are used for hunting, especially for bear hunting, for hunting the hounds type hunting. And most years it's averaged between about 20, 25, but we see an unusual high year in 2016 where 41 dogs were killed. But the contrary to that is 2012 when only 7 dogs were killed. And it's hard to say exactly what was going on, but there were some policy changes occurring at that time. So I think that was probably a bigger factor than the size of the wolf population, which didn't really increase during those years. So the last time wolves were delisted in 2012, we are delisted as part of the Great Lakes distinct population segment representing Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, and a little bit of the surrounding states, with the blue areas representing the places where we had breeding populations of wolves, the light blue kind of the areas that they could potentially disperse into. This remained delisted for 3 years, and then at the end of 2014 went back on the endangered species list. So with the delisting, there was landowners were given the authority to be able to use shoot wolves on their property, use lethal controls. And there are 2 circumstances under which landowners could do that. One would be they could shoot wolves in the act of attacks on domestic animals on their property. And the second is they could get a permit from the DNR to shoot wolves coming on their land after they've had a history of depredation problems, wolves coming on their land and killing and injuring livestock or pets in the past. And all these carcasses were turned over to DNR, so this did not represent a hunting or trapping season. the 2012, a wolf hunting season did start. It was set by the state legislature that required that states that the DNR shall hold a wolf hunting and trapping season when they weren't listed on either the state or federal list of endangered or threatened species. So this is an important point to remember, that the DNR is required when they're not listed to hold a hunting season. One of the issues that myself and others, Timberwolf Alliance, Timberwolf and Wisconsin Green Fire have concerns about, that we don't think that the hunting should be tied directly to the delisting. They should have been kept as separate issues, but that's our law currently. And the law allows a combination of a hunting and trapping season. The DNR is allowed to limit the quotas and permits and set up harvest zones, but the DNR is very limited in the authority on this bill. Much of the bill is written by the legislature, by special interest groups. And under the hunting seasons in 2012, 13, and 14, the season started October 15th. It lasted until the end of February or when the goal was achieved. It does require that within 24 hours, the hunter has to call in the animal, the wolf they harvested, and 5 days after the month of their harvest, they have to turn in the skinned wolf physically for examination. So this graph shows what the actual harvests were during those times in 2012, 13, and 14. And we see that 2012, the total harvest was about 117. If you remember the graphs I was showing earlier on, the wolf population remained about the same between those years. In 2013, there was more aggressive harvest. The wolf population declined by about 18% the next year. And the DNR backed off from the quotas the next year, reduced the harvest, and had a harvest of 154 in 2014. And that resulted in the wolf population going up about 12%. So it allowed the population to increase somewhat. And there you can see the 6 zones across the state. Most of you listening are probably in zone 1, where we are here in Cable, but zones 1, 2, and 5 kind of represented areas of core wolf areas. Zones 3 and 4 represented kind of more marginal areas along the edge of wolf range where problems are more likely to occur. And then zone 6 kind of represents the rest of the state, where mostly unsuitable areas for wolves. And the harvest kind of tried to keep the level of harvest relatively low in zones 1, 2, and 3, but more liberal in zones 3 and 4, and quite liberal in zone 6, where the habitat was not suitable for wolves. So an important point to make is that during those 3 years, the harvest never lasted beyond December. And here you see the columns of when the harvest ended in each zone in 2012, 13, and 14. In the first year, they were ending mostly in mid-November or early part of December. 2013, some of the zones were closing by late part of October, and a few lasted into December. And by 2014, some of the zones were closed in less than a week's time. The hunters and trappers were becoming very good at trapping and hunting wolves. And actually about 80% of the harvest by that year was by trapping. So currently we just have been recently delisted again. This time the delisting is broader than it had been in previous times, and all of the lower 48 states that was part of gray wolf range were now delisted, except a small area in the Southwest that represents the Mexican wolf range. Those areas are still listed as an endangered, and then parts of the Northern Rocky Mountains are already delisted. Those were delisted in 2011, actually by congressional action. So the current delisting, the delisting that occurred on January 4th, was for gray wolf range across the rest of the United States. So with the delisting, the possibility of this hunting season again occurs. And so here we see the hunting season that we just finished here in Wisconsin, where we had a overall quota of 119, and that quota was over 85% of the quota was harvested. So obviously the harvest went far beyond what the DNR had intended. During all the previous years when harvests were held, they were always within about 1 or 2% of the quota. So this represents a really unusual situation. And several reasons probably exist why the harvest was so far over. One of the reasons is that under the previous years of hunting, the use of hounds is only allowed after the firearm deer season, which occurs at the end of November, early December. And most years, dogs were not used in, or used to any limit, or used only to a very limited extent. In 2014, I think one zone was open to use of dogs. In 2013, two zones were open to use of dogs. So only a very limited extent. This current harvest was 86% by hounds. So most wolves were harvested by hounds, which a method that we previously hadn't used to any great extent in Wisconsin. The rest were 16 by just hunting over bait or with calls, and then 10 were captured by trapping, and 5 others where it wasn't reported. Of the harvest, 54% were males and 46% were females. We don't have the age distribution broken down yet. In those earlier harvests, generally half the wolves were young of the year, about a quarter were yearlings, and about a quarter were 2 years or older wolves. And it'd be that 2 years or older wolves that would be the breeding population. So the earlier harvest didn't seem to hit too much of the breeding population. We don't know whether this more current harvest has much more of an impact on the breeding population. And the number of applicants, of people that applied for permits, of 2,700, total awarded permits were 2,380, and of those that were actually sold, was 1,548. So that comes out to about 1.5 hunters per wolf in the state, and about 6 hunters per pack in the state. So a fairly aggressive harvest. And I want to just real quickly go over a little bit of the timeline and then start opening up to questions. But so the Fish and Wildlife Service first announced that the delisting was going to occur on November 3rd. Several of us did encourage the DNR to hold off holding a harvest until next fall. We felt the time was needed to carefully plan for the harvest, to make sure it was an inclusive process, that tribes would get involved, that we carefully plan for a scientifically managed harvest. And on December 4th, the Wisconsin DNR did announce they were going to wait till next fall to hold a wolf harvest. But the delisting did occur on January 4th. So the rule was published 2 months earlier and was finalized on January 4th. Less than 9 days later, a special meeting was held by the state Senate and Assembly to try to pressure DNR in holding a wolf hunt immediately. And that was followed by a special hearing by the Natural Resource Board. Several of us commented there, testified. Nearly 50 people testified at that meeting. And the Natural Resource Board did vote 4-3 to wait until fall for the wolf hunt. But on February 11th, a group called Hunters Nation, you had Wisconsin Institute of Law and Liberty sue the state of Wisconsin, the DNR, and force a wolf hunt. And a court trial was held in Jefferson County on February 11th, and the judge ordered the DNR to hold a hunt immediately, or within the next few days. So on February 15th, the Natural Resource Board had a special meeting to discuss the wolf hunt. They agreed to a quota of 200 wolves, but doubled the number of permits, which why they did that is unknown. And that's part of the reason we ended up with such an overharvest of the wolf population. The DNR did reduce the harvest quota to 119 by offering 81 of animals of the quota to the tribes, but unfortunately, because of the overharvest, it still resulted in more than 200 animals being harvested, and 2,380 licenses were awarded. The zones opened on the 21st. Two zones closed on 10 o'clock in the morning on the 23rd, or 3 zones in the morning and then 3 in the afternoon. And with the system of allowing people 24 hours to harvest wolves, it wasn't until 3 o'clock the next day that we knew exactly what the harvest was. So this is 219 wolves, 86% with the use of hounds was the legal harvest. I'm guessing probably there were some animals that were missed that either didn't get recovered in the field, and perhaps some that were shot that were never turned in. So the actual reported harvest is always going to be kind of a minimum of the number of wolves actually removed. So that kind of gets us to where we are right now, that we did have this very aggressive wolf hunt. Wisconsin DNR is starting to hold committee meetings to plan for next fall's hunt, and we'll be starting to develop a new wolf management plan this spring and summer, and hopefully have that in place by next year. So that's kind of where we're at, and at this point, open it up to questions and comments.
So thank you for that summary, Adrian. That was a lot of information. I'll jump right into the questions. Mike Cleven was wondering, he's a volunteer carnivore tracker, and he's wondering if the data collected by the trackers is open to the public.
No, the specific data for the trackers used by the trackers, done by trackers, is not available for the public. It's only used through the DNR for coming up with the state count.
Good. And wolves are a very hard animal to hunt. With how quickly the quota was reached, is it likely that the DNR has underestimated the population?
Well, that's a question that people are coming up with, but what we're finding is that with the use of hounds and under ideal tracking conditions and wolves in peak breeding conditions, when they're marking their territories, coming out to the edge of roads, following roads, that they're making themselves more available. They're close to where people are hunting. We've got very efficient hunting system, and wolves in vulnerable conditions and just ideal hunting conditions. Where full moons during those days, all of that helped with having a very efficient and very quick hunting of wolves. So I don't think that the rapid harvest has anything to do with the population being underestimated. Certainly our minimum count is going to be less than what the population is. DNR is now using a system called Occupancy Modeling, which gives a little bit higher count. The minimum count for this last winter was 1,034 wolves. The population estimation is about 1,200 wolves, so about 170 more wolves. And I think that's a reasonable estimation of the population.
All right, thank you. Marianne also asked, Act 169 states that there should be one hunt per year when wolves are not listed. So we've had that hunt for 2021, but the DNR is saying that they will have a second hunt this year in November 2021. And she's wondering, how that will impact reproduction in pups and things like that.
Well, I guess it's a combination of a biological and legal question. So the legal part of it is that the interpretations that the judge made in Jefferson County was that anytime wolves are delisted, and we're in that time period from October through February when wolves can be hunted, although it's modified now to November to February when wolves can be hunted, then they should be hunted. So it's interpretation of the law that if we're during that time period and they're not listed, there should be a hunting season. As far as what the impacts are on pup production, just this winter's hunt, now we know that this is the peak breeding period. We are expecting that females that were harvested probably already had bred this year. Wolves have one estrus period a year. And so if you remove the female with fetuses in her from that pack, any new female joining that pack is probably not going to breed because they've already had their annual estrus. So there's little chance that those packs are going to have pups. So we're expecting a lot of our packs are probably not going to produce pups this year. How much it will affect things by next year, or that will depend the aggressiveness of next fall's harvest, and how aggressive that next fall's harvest will be sort of depend on the kind of data we get from this winter's population.
All right. And Tom Mathai would like to know how the harvest quota is set.
It's usually based on some estimation of the department making a decision to maintain populations in some areas or perhaps allow for some slight reductions. And based on literature of wolves harvest in other locations, there's some scientific evidence that you can harvest a wolf population at about 22 to 30% of the population without causing the population decline, and allows the population to remain relatively stable. But what's less clear is when you're comparing it to the population. So 20 to 30% of a fall population is probably quite a bit different than 20 to 30% of a midwinter population. So that's a part that I think still has a lot of uncertainty to it when you're harvesting in the middle of the winter like this, what the impacts are going to be. If you set a 20% harvest on a fall population, you've got a lot more wolves on the landscape. There's wolves dying all the time. We know one of the toughest times for wolves is our regular hunting seasons, when we get a lot of illegal kill on wolves. So typically from October until January, we're going to lose 10-15% of the population, whether we have a harvest or not. So if you hold the harvest, and after that time period, those animals have already been removed from that population. So you're removing from a much smaller population.
All right.
That next question is mine. It's really long. So if you want me to just talk, I could. It's
I
really
was
long
going
to
to
read.
summarize it and shorten it, since I am also an editor. Is that okay?
Okay.
With you?
Yeah. Yeah. Or I could, yeah, either way.
So basically you're asking about the use of hounds. Is it unethical? And was that part of what sort of sped up this season? Would the season be able to last longer than if we didn't allow use of hounds?
I guess as far as the ethics of using hounds, I'm going to talk mainly about the biological aspects of it. And that's kind of a value judgment, and different people are going to have different opinions as to whether hounds should or shouldn't be used. But I think from a biological standpoint, it seems to be a very aggressive sort of a hunting season. And from a behavioral standpoint, there's a lot of concerns that you're putting dogs on dogs, that there's likely going to be fights and aggression between the animals. So that's not a good idea. And it apparently is a very effective system. Wisconsin is the only U.S. state that allows the use of dogs for hunting wolves. And I'm not aware, I think Ontario allows some limited use of dogs for hunting wolves, but for most part, dogs are not used for hunting wolves in most places in the world. In the U.S., dogs are much more commonly used to hunt deer. Many southern states hunt deer with dogs, and in some ways, in parts of Wisconsin where we've got major problems with chronic wasting disease, that maybe is what we should be doing, is using dogs for hunting our deer. But it makes, when you're hunting another canid with dogs, I think it just sets up conflicts. And it's obviously a very aggressive harvest system. They very quickly remove animals from the populations. I know in 2013 and 2014, where there was some limited hunting of hounds, that those harvests went very, very quickly, that when they're being trapped with foothold traps or being hunted over bait, the harvest went at a fairly regular rate, and it was relatively easy for the DNR to plan closures and plan the quotas. But once hounds came into play, the harvest just went so quickly, it was very difficult to anticipate when the harvest was going to be achieved.
All right. And then the next question is about the studies looking at sort of the impacts of harvest on population size. So, you know, if you cull predators, do they actually just replace themselves anyway? And then also the impact of hunting wolves on potentially increasing their attacks on livestock versus decreasing them.
Yeah, that's a hypothesis that's been presented by some people, that potentially disruption of wolf packs might actually increase levels of depredations. And I think that it's going to vary. What we see often is packs that start killing livestock. It's often when they're starting to raise pups and they have high food needs and high calorie needs to feed pups, and having an easier prey nearby might encourage them to prey on livestock. But in general, wolves are fearful going near farms. Most wolves seem to avoid farms. And I'm not sure that breaking up packs necessarily would cause them to go to farms. They're still going to be fearful of people, but they will look for easier food sources, road kills, smaller animals, less killing of deer, hunting more on smaller animals. When you think about it, yes, farms are livestock are probably less resistant to fighting predators than wild animals. But when you're talking about a 1,000-pound cow, that's still a big animal. And these wolves still have to be able to kill adult-sized deer-like animals in order to be killing those livestock. So animals that don't have experience in broken up packs are not likely to head toward livestock as their first choice, unless there's livestock food pits or pits where remains of livestock are left. That might attract them, but going at adult livestock or even calves that are being guarded by adult cows for inexperienced wolves, I don't see that readily happening.
Okay, thanks. What can we do to prevent a wolf harvest from happening again?
Well, at this point, the only thing that could prevent a wolf harvest from occurring again would be legislation. You would have to have legislators on your side that would stop a wolf harvest. And I see that not likely happening. The groups I work with, we are trying to encourage legislators to come up with a more reasonable harvest and include things that the DNR may hold a harvest instead of shall hold a harvest, and remove the detailed language out of the wolf harvest bill and allow DNR to develop that as part of the administrative rules by DNR, which would include when the season opens, when it closes, what parts of the state are open to wolf hunting, what parts are closed to wolf hunting, what methods of take would be allowed. And if methods of take, I think we're exposed to large public inclusions, I don't think things like hunting with hounds would ever have occurred, but the public really didn't have much say about how wolves were going to be harvested.
All right. Is there any data about how many dogs were injured or killed during the hunt?
That's going to be one of the most difficult pieces of data to find. And I'm convinced with with knowledge of wolf behavior and dog behavior that there had to be some injuries and probably death of dogs, but there is really no incentive from the groups that want to be able to use their dogs to hunt wolves to report their dogs being killed by wolves. So unlike the situation with when you hunt bears with dogs, if your dogs get killed by wolves, the DNR does reimburse you. But in the case of hunting wolves with dogs, there's no reimbursement. So there really is no incentive for anybody using their dogs to hunt wolves to report it to the DNR. So unless some veterinarian treating dogs reported it, there really isn't any good data source to find that out.
Yeah, that is a tough one. Another question, will the recent harvest kind of overreach be considered in the formula when they set the numbers for the harvest next November?
Well, I think certainly, I hope so. I'm going to be one of the people serving on the committee to recommend the harvest, and I think that will be an important consideration. It'll be difficult to get a complete understanding of what the impacts of this harvest will be, though. Unfortunately, the two things that really would have been useful to get out of this harvest would have been collection of carcasses, and for some reason DNR did not require people to turn their carcasses into the DNR, which was always required in previous wolf hunts. And that means we have no opportunity to examine the females to determine if they are pregnant. So determine the percentage of females, pregnant females removed from the population. That would have been a very useful item. Another useful survey would be doing summer house surveys and determine which packs have produced pups this year. Unfortunately, by the time the quota gets set, that data, it'll be too late to use that data to inform the harvest. So I'm not sure yet exactly what methods will be used to determine what the impacts of this harvest will be, but probably looking at harvest system in other states and countries and seeing what similar type harvests have done to their wolf population would be about the only way we'd be able to get some idea about that.
Okay, thanks. And then a question about the DNR. So since the DNR is funded, at least in part, by hunting permits, how can citizens who support wildlife values sort of make sure that we are also represented in their decisions?
Well, I think attend meetings, right? Natural Resource Board meetings are all public meetings that people can testify at and send messages and write to, what? Comments in the back room here. People can, the applications are open right now for people to join the DNR's Wolf Committee for advising on developing a new plan. There will be only a limited number of people probably allowed on that committee, but certainly support organizations that are represented on the committee, maintain communications with those people, talk to your legislators, make sure that your thoughts and your concerns are being considered. Those are, I guess, some of the things that I can think about.
Thanks. Have you heard any potential backlash from the tribes about the wolf hunt and potentially increasing their walleye spearing as a response?
I haven't heard anything along those lines. I know the tribes are very concerned about it, and they're very upset that this harvest went the way it did, and that they felt they weren't given adequate opportunity for consultation. I think it's going to require some extra steps on the part of DNR, Natural Resource Board, to make sure the tribes are going to be considered thoroughly in the next harvest system.
All right, lots of questions. I'm looking through them. What changes for the next wolf hunt would you recommend to the Natural Resources Board?
To the Natural Resource Board, I guess we discourage them from increasing number of permits beyond what the DNR recommends. Probably a relatively conservative harvest at this point. Haven't looked at the numbers, haven't done a careful examination of all the factors that we need to consider for considering a quota. But the main thing that the Natural Resource Board can do is just comment on the quotas and the level of the harvest. So the changes that are needed in the wolf hunting regulations are, as I said earlier, are needed to be legislatively done, not really what the Natural Resource Board is going to be able to do.
Okay. Brenda is wondering how to respond to questions she gets about the DNR said the max population of wolves for Wisconsin should be only 350. So, what is the true relevance of that number of 350 to the wolf hunts in our management plan?
So that was the number from our 1999 wolf plan. I think I got a sneeze coming on. Sorry about that. I'll try to hold that sneeze off, but it might still come. So in the 1999 wolf plan, a 22-year-old plan, we planned a harvest of, or we planned a goal of 350 wolves. At a time, we had less than 200 wolves in Wisconsin. And at a time, we thought the potential biological carrying capacity was about 500 wolves for Wisconsin. We've already seen the wolf population has grown far beyond that. Our most recent estimates of biological carrying capacity suggest that it's probably somewhere in the range of about 1,250. So we are probably starting to approach the natural biological carrying capacity. But that 350 number was based on a much earlier understanding of the carrying capacity of the population viability analysis. And we're seeing now with other wildlife species, we're not managing our deer herds at goals we set for them 25 years ago. We're not managing our bear population at goals we set for them 25 years ago. So it makes really no sense to do that for the wolf population either. We have to deal with the wolves that are living on the landscape and where they're living and maintain the populations. I don't see us having to reduce drastically the wolf population on the landscape. There may be some areas we may need to reduce it somewhat because of conflict, but in general, I think we're approaching the carrying capacity, and I think we're probably at a level that the population seems reasonable.
Thanks. Is there any data about how many collared wolves were harvested versus the percent of collared wolves across the population?
I haven't seen anything on that yet. It hasn't been reported by the department. I think going into the wolf harvest, there were something like 50 some wolves on the air out of the population of 1,000 some wolves. But I haven't seen yet what percentage of those animals were removed.
Do you have any advice about educating the public or just people who have an animosity toward wolves. And how can we educate people about, you know, the actual numbers of livestock and dog deaths, and not when people feel they're inflated.
Well, I guess is get as much of the actual data as you can. DNR has reports online every year. The reports the wolf population has the details of the numbers of farms that have had depredations, the number of livestock that have been killed. So I guess make yourself as knowledgeable of the actual data that's out there, so that when people say there's a 70% increase in depredations, what does that mean and what are they talking about? It's just a matter of, I guess, educating yourself and then sharing that information. And yeah, the data is out there. DNR reports this online on their wolf webpage. So just that would be my recommendation.
Mm-hmm.
People who have strong animosity, usually facts alone are not going to change their opinion. So I think that's a long-term process.
Absolutely. And I was just reading an article today about how actually listening to what people have to say is oftentimes more effective. They want to be heard, and then responding with curiosity potentially can do more to help them see the light, see your light.
Yeah, if you're talking to somebody who just had their dog killed by a wolf and you try lecturing them about the ecological value of wolves, you're not going to probably make a wolf lover out of them.
Yeah, probably. Do you know how many out-of-state hunters there were that received permits, and how many, out-of-state, okay, I see. How many out-of-state hunters received permits and how many out-of-state hunters filled their tags?
I'm just looking at some data that I'd gotten here that of the people that applied for permits, looks like out of this, about 1,200 people applied for permits that were out of state people. And that's out of 27,000 permits. So about, almost 1,300 out of 27,000 permits were out of state people. So I guess if permits were allocated evenly, you could probably come up with some estimate of what, but I don't have the exact data number of permits that went to non-state, non-residents.
All right, thank you. There's a question for me. Has the Cable Natural History Museum done educational classes about wolves and the benefits they bring? Yes, we have. Actually, I just finished the winter round of museum mobile visits, and our 3rd grade lesson is all about wolves, coyotes, and foxes. And one of the things that I talk to the kids about is that not a trophic cascade, but how wolves impact coyotes and impact foxes, and then also reduce Lyme disease on the landscape. So it was really fun to teach that to kids. And in the 3rd grade fall lesson, we also talk about food webs and talk about the wolves in Yellowstone and how they really impacted that landscape as well. So we do talk about wolves and how awesome they are. And let's see. Elizabeth is also asking to share names of Wisconsin organizations that are working to protect wolves. So if you have links, and maybe Adrian, you can even get me these after the presentation, and I can send everybody an email too.
Sure. So the groups that come to mind right away are the Timberwolf Alliance in Wisconsin out of Ashland, and Wisconsin Green Fire, a relatively new group that promotes sound science and natural resource management. We are involved in wolf conservation. There's also the International Wolf Center nearby that is involved in a lot of wolf conservation work out of Minnesota. Then also Timberwolf Information Network in Wisconsin, but I can get you the links for all those organizations afterwards. And then there's various other environmental groups that have different perspectives on wolf management. So in groups like Timberwolf Alliance and Wisconsin Green Fire, we try not to play the parts of advocacy groups except for advocating for the sound science. So we're not nitpicking on every different issues of, and we're not opposing the delisting of wolves, nor are we actually opposing necessarily the hunting seasons of wolves, but we do recommend that if you have hunting seasons, they be based on sound science, and they be an inclusive, open process, and especially that there's broad involvement by the tribes, and that they have an adequate opportunity to get involved with the process.
All right, thanks. Do you know how many dogs are killed by wolves during bear season?
So I shown that, yeah, I did show a table figure, and it ranges anywhere from, in the last 10 years, from 7 to 41. But over the last 10 years, it averages close to 20 dogs per year that are killed each year by bears, by wolves. Did they ask wolves?
Killed by wolves during bear season, so
Yes.
that they're reimbursed.
Yes. So the other question there, which I don't have an answer for, would be how many dogs get killed by bears, which is probably a lot more, but we don't have any statistics on that.
Okay. Is it correct that the hunting group that sued for the hunt to go on was based out of state? And
Yeah, they are out of, yes, they are out of Kansas City, I believe, but the CEO is a Wisconsin resident who was kind of heading up the lawsuit.
okay. And there's a question about poaching too, with the lack of DNR field staff. Should we expect more poaching in the future? And is there anything we can do to prevent it?
Well, one of our hopes would have been that a carefully regulated wolf hunt would reduce poaching, and we saw some evidence in a period from 2003 through 2011 that when the state had some management authority, there was a reduction in poaching versus when they were listed as endangered species. But I'm fearful that the kind of hunt we had this last week, it wasn't a highly regulated hunting season, and I'm fearful it actually encouraged poaching. So I think law enforcement work, that ongoing kind of law enforcement work where they continue to investigate illegal killing of wolves whenever they can. One of the issues that has been happening, and I don't know if it'll happen again after the hunt this year, but we've seen incidents of poisoning occurring across various places in northern Wisconsin, which we suspect are being, especially targeting wolves, but poisoned meats being left out in the woods for predators to pick up. And several of our organizations are trying to promote better reward systems to try to capture the people or catch the people who are doing that.
Great, thanks. So with a population of 1,200 wolves, do you think it's necessary to have an annual hunt to manage those? Do we need to have a hunt in order to manage the numbers, however big they get?
I guess the necessary becomes kind of a value judgment. There are some values to holding a hunt. It can help regulate a wolf population. It potentially can get more people involved and maybe supporting of wolf management. People can obtain furs and useful products from wolves. So it has some potential benefits. There may be some slight reduction in farm depredations and depredations on pets near homes by having hunting season, because the wolves that get removed most quickly are those that are probably most tolerant of people and least fearful of people. So there probably are some benefits. Whether it's necessary, to some extent, wolves are pretty good at regulating their own populations. They maintain strict territories, and they maintain their populations within those territories. And you look at places like Yellowstone, that population pretty well regulates itself there just through their own territorial behavior. But wolves aren't managing their territories or their populations to serve humans. They're serving it for their own benefit. So if there are places where we need to have some reduction in wolves because of conflicts, yes, a hunting season can have some benefits. So it's kind of a mixed bag. It can have some benefits. There's some detriments as well.
Thanks. And there's a question too about what it would take. Oh gosh, no, I just lost it. What would have to happen to move management over to the DNR and out of legislative hands?
Legislation. One word.
Sure.
Again, a change in the wolf hunting regulations that allows the DNR to determine if a wolf harvest should occur and allow DNR to develop the administrative rules and when, where, how long, by what methods. And instead of a 12-page report on a wolf harvest, it needs to be only a few paragraphs and give the DNR the authority. So again, legislation.
Is there any place to report suspicious activity outside of hunting seasons? Or do you actually have to catch poachers in the act to report it?
No, there is a DNR tip line, and any copy of the wolf of any hunting fishing regulations has that number on it, the tip line. And you can find it right away on the DNR websites as well to report any, and you can do those confidentially, or you can provide your name and information. But so there are places to report those things.
Good, thank you. Those are the questions that I see. If I truncated your question, or if you have a follow-up question, go ahead and add that into the chat or raise your hand. And in the meantime, I had a question raised actually by one of the third graders that I was teaching last week.
No, you're going to give me a really tough question now.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's this, they brought up this rumor that wolves will whine to lure their dog into the woods to eat them.
I've not heard that. I've heard both for wolves and coyotes of a single wolf or coyote running into a yard and then running away and having the dogs or whatever chase them. And I'm not sure if that's true either. I've heard that rumor, but as far as whining to lure dogs, I don't know. Well, as Sarah points out, yeah, if you did have a wolf nearby, they might whine if they're trying to get friendly with the dogs. And not all dog wolf encounters do end up bad. Sometimes dogs and wolves kind of get friendly with each other.
Interesting. Any other questions from folks? This was a lot of information. Thank you, Adrian, for this marathon session.
Thanks. So if folks have additional questions, go ahead and get a hold of me. And but thanks for joining us, and this worked out very well. Thank you.
Yeah, we have another question about the economics of wolf hunting.
Okay.
Does the state make money from it, and how much do those hunters contribute to the economy too?
So each hunter pays $10 to apply for a wolf hunting license, and if they get a license, they pay $49 for the permit. So yeah, basically $60 for everybody who successfully gets a permit. So you can look at those numbers that I pulled out earlier, and you can come up with a number of the amount of money that goes directly to DNR. And then I'm sure the bars, restaurants, other businesses, gas stations in areas where wolf hunting. I think Clam Lake had some busy times last week from some of the wolf hunters. One of their bars had a lot of activity. So I don't know if that's more from they would have gotten from the snowmobilers, but so it brings in some local business, that's for sure.
All right. And there's a question about how folks can contact you. Adrian, is it okay if I send your email around when I send links
Sure.
to organizations you mentioned? I'll send that. And it was written on his last slide too, if you want to go back when I have the presentation recorded. Another question about, are dog hunters regulated in any way when reporting a dog predation? Does the dog owner have to supply proof of license and vaccination for that dog?
Well, if they have a depredation during like the bear hunting or bear training period, and they want to get reimbursed, and they can get reimbursed up to $2,500 for their dogs, they have to have a federal agent that comes to the site and actually examines the dogs, and often sometimes has to skin the dog to do kind of an autopsy of sorts. So yeah, so they have to make the animal, their dog, available for that examination, and that agent then examines the whole site and and all the sign in the area to determine whether it was likely caused by wolves.
Great, thank you. All right, well, that's the end of the fresh questions. So, and it is 8 o'clock.
Okay.
Yeah,
Sarah has a
thank you
question.
so much. Oh, Sarah wants to add something?
Yeah, hi, everybody. I just want to say that this is all factual and meant to give you the information, unbiased information. But last week for us and for those of us that have worked for a good part of our lives in conservation and education for benefiting the wolves here. It was a very stressful week for us and very emotional too, to see these animals, the way that they were hunted or killed. It was very hard to see because I was out there working and I encountered that activity and the way that this all took place and where wolves had been killed. It was very hard for us. And so we appreciate your support and concern for this. So thank you.
Thank you.
I don't think I'm there. Because, I mean, I agreed that there
Was there another question, Ned, or?
I don't
me.
know. Deborah, did you have a question? Is that why you unmuted yourself? Okay, so I think that's it. Thank you, Sarah, for adding that. I know a lot of us are here tonight because we care deeply about the wolves as you do. And thank you, Adrian, for presenting the facts and a balanced discussion of the issue. There's a lot going on there. And it's good for us to sort of learn the details so that we can educate other people as well. Thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night.
Have a good night.
Thank you.